There's so much more socially constructed meaning in the way we speak than people realize. Do you expect someone to sound different depending on whether you're listening to a man or a woman? Whether you've decided that the person is gay or straight?
We all have preconceptions about how people's voices will match their faces. And previous studies suggest people are better at recognizing faces within their own ethnic group. We're asking the question of how much that same principle extends into speech perception.
Since all of the existing research in the field of speech-language hearing sciences is based solely on white varieties, we realized that to study this question, we had to create a new database pulling from a more diverse population sample.
Creating this resource for anyone to use is an important contribution to increasing representation in research, and a step towards addressing historical inequity in the discipline of speech-language hearing sciences as a whole. If we want our science to reflect reality, then we need our research data to reflect it as well. My standard cocktail party explanation to people that I avoid using in professional contexts usually, but it's really, I feel just viscerally accessible to people when I explain it this way, is that my research is concerned with how people learn and understand the difference between someone saying, "That's f***ed up," or "That's f***ed up." Ostensibly, these are the same phrases. It's the same words in the same order. And yet you have a very strong intuition about what kind of person would say which one and how their meaning would be very fundamentally different. And all of that is just based, that's all embedded in the phonetics and also your social expectations of those phonetics. So, yeah, like it almost always gets a laugh because people, they agree instantly that, like, of course I can perceive predictable differences between how the people who would say those things would look and act. Yeah. And yet, there's this topic is just, I just continue the whole time I was putting my dissertation together, I'm just like, how has nobody done this before? I just kept expecting to find where, somebody had actually already done such a study 20 years ago and found nothing. So that would be why no one's looked at this, because it's boring. But no, the reason that no one's looked at it is just because it's difficult and it's unpopular.
And I think it, at least from the standpoint, like that, I think that this is a reflection of racism, right? That for a non-white person to look at this, they're going to say, oh, well, then I'm just going to be stereotyped as the person who looks at race and language and, and not the person who does linguistics with a capital L or speech language hearing sciences with capital SLHS. And for a white person, I mean, probably most of them would realize, like, I don't really have the social and cultural capital to be able to do this the right way. Well, if there's somebody who didn't do this, the good reason would be to say, I don't have the social and cultural capital to do this the right way.
But just traditional linguistic theory supposes that in order to learn to recognize that sequence of words, all of that information that distinguishes them socially, you don't need any of that. Yeah. Like somehow you have to filter it out and ignore it just to learn which words are which. And I think that's just preposterous.
I had wanted to do a project on how people's perception of talk or race affects how easily they're understood for a long time, and had this idea in my head for a grant application for a number of years. And I finally, in fall of 2018, wrote that grant and submitted it to the National Institutes of Health, and put in there that I would like for the duration of the grant to be able to hire a postdoctoral researcher who would work with me on this grant. So I saw this as something that would be a good opportunity for someone perhaps with a background in linguistics or maybe social psychology who wanted to come to speech language hearing sciences and do some cross-disciplinary work. So I submitted this grant thinking that what was going to happen is what usually happens to grants like this, that there are multiple rounds of revision and that it's quite uncertain whether they're ever going to get funded. Much to my great surprise, it was funded the first round and scored very, very favorably. So I immediately was thinking, all right, I have to find the right person to work on this grant. And so I reached out to people in my professional network and said, do you know of anyone who would be appropriate to work on this grant, who would be interested, who would really enjoy the work and see it as an extension of what they'd already done. And a longtime colleague of mine, Jan Edwards, who is currently at the University of Maryland, said, we have the perfect person, and put me in contact with Dr. Tripp, and really the rest is history from my standpoint. So I reached out to Dr. Tripp, they came up to interview, and it was, I think, a really good fit, and that's how we came to work together.
I was just finishing my doctorate, and I was having a terrible time. I'm trying to find a place that would be a really good fit. And when this listing came along, it's like it was written just for me.
One thing that makes for a very good professional collaboration between me and Dr. Tripp is that not only do we share an interest in the topic of this project that we're working on right now, but we share another interest, and maybe even a little bit stronger interest, in how children learn the social functions of speech and language. So this was the topic of Dr. Tripp's dissertation, which looked at computational models of how children's social understanding shapes their speech perception. And this has very much been an interest of mine as well, particularly how children's growing and emerging gender identity affects the way that they speak, the way that they use spoken language. And I feel like a lot of our kind of incidental conversations and kind of long-term planning in that area have been just above and beyond anything I could have hoped for when Dr. Tripp agreed to take this position.
My dissertation work is on infants.
Yes.
So I was really hoping when I was looking for a postdoctoral position to get to branch out from that point in the lifespan, and really it was mostly looking to land something where I could work with children and look at how this develops in kids. But to find something with a project headed by someone who I knew was really interested in these developmental questions, and it's always very strange to cite someone often and then meet them. I had this concept of Dr. Munson's interests, and I had a good sense that our interests would align beyond just this project, despite being a study of perception in adults and older adults, that it shares a lot of themes with the work that I've done in infants. So we are both very interested in being able to tell sort of a more complete developmental story about how the mental constructs that people use to navigate linguistic interactions develop, and what their structure is and how they change over time.
Well, this has been a lifelong interest of mine. I had the great fortune of growing up in a very linguistically and socially diverse environment. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and when my family moved to Buffalo from a small town south of Buffalo in 1977, in the midst of the blizzard of '77, a pretty epic snow event in Buffalo, my parents really wanted me and my sister to go to schools that looked very unlike the schools that they had gone to. And so they opted to enroll us in a school called the Coalition for Action, Unity, and Social Equality that was run by a group of people who had initially met each other in a commune that they lived in. And so this was a school that was founded to be explicitly focused on social justice, anti-racism, and though it was a magnet school within the Buffalo Public Schools, it really functioned as a rogue element. And so for the first, 7 or 8 years of my schooling, I was in an environment where we were talking about social issues, social justice, social inequities, really at the expense of many of the other traditional topics. I'm not even sure that I could name all of the presidents of the United States. Those were not simply issues that we talked about. And so just growing up, I grew up in a linguistically diverse environment. Many of my classmates used African American language. Many of our teachers and the teacher aides in the school used African American language. At home, my mother and my father, who had grown up my father in the country and my mother in working class neighborhoods in Buffalo, used a very different variety of language. And just the linguistic differences across lines of race and ethnicity were something that were very salient and talked about, and wed that to the idea of thinking of these as loci of both of agency, people's use of different varieties to show and demonstrate and assert their identities, but also as loci of discrimination, to see different varieties denigrated and talked about as less than. This is something that was just a part of the first decade of my life. And when I went into college and eventually found speech language hearing sciences by way of linguistics, my thought was, well, I don't see this being talked about in my courses, and so this must not be a worthy area of study. There was certainly research on African American language, or African American vernacular English, as it was generally referred to at the time. But this was always talked about as there's this variety of English that these people use, and it's different from the other varieties in these ways. People weren't really talking about the issues that were on my mind of how different language varieties could shape people's understanding of a person, could sway people to interpret a person one way or another. And for a long time, I thought, well, just isn't something that I can study. And then I eventually finished my PhD on a topic very different from this, came to the University of Minnesota and continued to pursue that topic very different from this, but realized that, if I was going to eventually get tenure, which I did, I would have academic freedom, and I could parlay the successes that I had, the privilege that I have, the resources that I have, to stake out and start to look at these topics that I believed in the core of my soul were important and worthy of investigation, and that sort of those were the seeds of what you're seeing in this line of research we've been talking about.
When talking about the wealth of work that's been done on African American English, I feel like it's really important I often see it cited that it is one of the most studied varieties of English, and I think that it's important to contextualize that, the reasons why people found it necessary to study it, that traditionally it was studied as evidence of deficiency in the people who spoke it, and there are people who have researched it since who have taken on the goal of correcting those racist assumptions, but underlying all of that wealth of work is this history of racism. I was very conscious of code switching behavior when I was a child, I think partly owing to the fact that I have autism. I was always very conscious of these choices that people were making and how effortlessly and intuitively they seemed to understand things that I felt I always had to put effort into. When I started my doctorate, I think I spent a long time shying away from the topics which interested me most because I was afraid of how they would be perceived. On the first day of pretty much any linguistics class, they generally cover the distinction between a dialect and a language. And it's the consensus in linguistics is that this is a political distinction, and it is not of interest to language scientists who are focused on the theoretical underpinnings of the human ability to use language. I was rather shocked to find out that linguists really can't answer the question of what the difference between a dialect and a language is, because it's been decided that's not relevant. And yet we all have intuitions about how different language varieties are related. So these labels of dialect and language we generally avoid these days, and we speak about language varieties. But I was always really interested in how people perceived differences between language varieties, and I was really disappointed to find out that linguistics, which is a really young field, has just not tackled these issues. And it took me a while to get the courage to really try to take that on. There were numerous incidents where other graduate students in the linguistic department who were also tasked with teaching introductory linguistic students would say to me that Black English was broken, that it was evidence of deficiency. And then these are ideas that they were responsible for debunking in their students. And I found that my professional environment suffered greatly despite their great level of education, that their bias on this topic was really difficult for me to navigate. And it took me a while to determine that if I didn't pursue this topic, that it really wasn't worth it to me to be in the field.
So I want to jump in here and say, so when I came into this project, I had this very sort of NIH mindset, this sort of science with a capital S mindset, that we have this body of evidence that suggests that when you look at someone and you're about to perceive them saying something, you're making these sort of social evaluations about them based on the way that they look, and you're sort of calibrating your expectations based on that, and that the kinds of expectations that you build up during that calibration process are going to make that person harder or easier to understand, maybe because you're expecting a particular racialized variety of language that that person doesn't produce, or maybe because you see that that person is from a race that you have either explicit or implicit negative attitudes about, implicit or explicit racism, and you're going to put in more or less effort perceiving them because of that. And this was very much sort of ready set for a specific aims page of an NIH grant. This first page of the grant that really, as a grant reviewer, makes or breaks it. And that worked to get this grant funded, and that's great. But even within just the first couple of weeks of Dr. Tripp and me working together, I came to appreciate the question with so much more depth and nuance than I ever had before. And so if I think about some of the things that Dr. Tripp just said, when you look at someone and you're thinking, am I about to hear a language or a dialect, right? Then if your dialect is something that you believe to be broken, I think that puts more teeth, more specificity on the kinds of, what I called in the NIH application, implicit negative attitudes. That, Dr. Tripp's scholarship in this area, their deep reading of the literature, their lived experience, provides far more specificity, far more context, far more nuance to that in a way that I think has really shaped, it's been transformative for me in 100 different ways. But I also think it just makes for immensely better science, especially when we think to the kinds of developmental work that we have. So, let's think about the kid who's, just at the cusp of language acquisition, the kid who's 18 months old, right at the cusp of the vocabulary spurt and multi-word utterances, and this kid is really kind of building their linguistic repertoire from the ground up. The kinds of decisions that that child makes about what is me and what's not me, what's in my sphere and what's not in my sphere. Of the things that aren't in my sphere, what are the things that I want to be able to co-opt if I need to? So what are the resources I want to hold close to me in case I need to use them strategically to my advantage? Kids are making these appraisals at exactly that moment in development, and those appraisals carry over to the point in the lifespan that Dr. Tripp and I are looking at now, younger and older adults.
I was very focused on sort of theoretical underpinnings of how infants and children understand speech sounds, and it became really evident that all of the evidence that I was looking at was gathered from very specific language varieties, and that very little could be extrapolated from that to describe how listeners navigate different kinds of social distinctions between talkers. So I decided that I wanted to take a sociolinguistics class, and so on the first day of this course, the professor asserted that while we all pay attention to these linguistic variations between people, that we don't apply that same kind of discernment to other social behaviors. So he said, like, we don't have specific walks. Like, people don't walk differently. And I said, but they do. People do walk differently depending on the groups that they belong to. And I mean, people invent different kinds of shoes just for the purpose of making sure that their walks are different. So I was really dismayed that the thinking was so focused in on language as a very special way that people use to categorize people. And I realized that from within linguistics alone, that I couldn't capture the topics that I wanted to look at about how infants and children learn to categorize people, but that visual information and information, emotional information, that I would need to go to developmental psychology and to speech language hearing sciences to see how distinctions between atypical and normally developing children could illuminate the mechanisms behind these kinds of categorizations, and that looking at language alone would not cut it.
To be able to study this question of how people perceive speech produced by individuals of various races, ethnicities, the first thing you need are speech samples produced by people of various races/ethnicities. And so we can't just go to some off-the-shelf corpus of speech that happens by design or unintentionally to have great racial diversity. Such a corpus doesn't exist. The corpora that we have of spoken language are overwhelmingly based on white varieties. So the first thing that we had to do was figure out how we were going to collect masses of audiovisual speech data from people of various races and ethnicities. And so initially we designed a data elicitation protocol with, I wouldn't say professional quality recording equipment quite like this, but pretty close to it, that we would have recorded in the sound booth in my laboratory in Shevlin Hall. And after recording 2 people in that protocol, COVID happened. And so we really were wringing our hands because it was pretty evident from the early part of the pandemic that this was not going to be something that would be solved by summer's end. And so we had to face the realities of kind of the limited resources that the grant, I mean, every grant has limited resources, including this one. And how are we going to stay productive and answer the questions of the grant? And the fact that we were on video conferencing calls most of the day sort of inspired us that we could actually collect some data that were much less controlled data, but sort of a lot of more naturalistic data on video conferencing calls. And so with that in mind, Dr. Tripp, who I will ping pong over to right now, Dr. Tripp came up with a really elegant data collection protocol for Zoom, one that I can say as a member of the IRB, other people are using in terms, not necessarily the specific types of data that we're recording, but in terms of things like the privacy controls and the protection of human subjects. This is all from Dr. Tripp.
So the first thing that we have to do is ensure that our participant is signed in from a relatively secure location, privacy-wise. We don't want to record anybody who hasn't agreed to be on our recordings. Once they've confirmed that they're indoors and they don't expect to be interrupted, then we go over some forms. So we go over the consent form, which explains to them exactly what data we plan to collect and what we're going to do with it. On the demographic form, they'll report their gender, ethnicity, et cetera, as well as answer a lot of questions about their exposure to various languages as children. All of our participants did learn English from birth, but many were also exposed to other languages. We asked them to describe the languages that their caretakers used and how often they spent time with each of them. And we also administer a bunch of questions about their hearing ability. When we were doing this in the lab, we would use a standard hearing screening, which we couldn't do over Zoom, but actually the questionnaire that we're using on Zoom is much more in depth and tells us a lot more about how our participants experience listening to speech. After we're done with the forms, then we make a quick test recording, or we'll walk them through the experimental protocol, which is a bit tedious. What we do.
It's cool. It's cool. The way that Dr. Tripp came up with eliciting the sentences is really cool.
So we read the sentence to the participant, and we ask them to repeat it back to us from memory, because we don't want them to sound like they're reading. But we found that if we just do that, if I just read the sentence in a normal cadence and ask them to repeat it back, they mimic the experimenter's cadence really closely. So we would supply the sentence with very odd prosody or rhythm and put emphasis on words that you might not expect to guarantee that the participant wouldn't want to mimic us because they would sound ridiculous. So an example sentence is, her purse was full of useless trash. And if I said it that way, then they would repeat it, her purse was full of useless trash. So instead of saying it naturally, what I would say is, her purse was full of useless trash. Which then forces them to process which words were said and have to run them back, but definitely not say it the way I said it. It just is completely unnatural. So it was a bit challenging to train the other researchers to use this prosody because it does sound really strange and you feel really silly delivering it. But it did get our participants to give us much more spontaneous, natural productions.
This was a brand new invention. Like, this did not come from a published article, right?
It's just trial and error. As I realized when we were doing those first couple with pilots, we were still in the lab at that time, that their tendency to mimic me was so strong that I couldn't rely on the participants to provide their own pronunciation of words even. If I used the word aunt instead of aunt, they would say it the way I said it, and I wouldn't know how they would have otherwise said it. So providing the sentences in this distorted way really encouraged them to give us very natural productions. Now that I've had to read every sentence to a participant several times over, I tend to have my favorite silly way of saying that sentence.
I have a question. So of our undergraduates who are running sessions along with you or sometimes independently, are there differences in their willingness to learn this? Did some have an easier time than others?
Some definitely did have an easier time than others. This is my first time really supervising undergraduates on a project. And so this has been a new experience, a really valuable experience for me. The undergraduates that I've been working with are just fantastic. And being an undergraduate isn't so long ago for me. And so I felt I could really keenly relate to their trepidation in looking silly and not coming across as serious researchers. So it was really important to me to establish with them that it's okay to look silly sometimes. Sometimes it's necessary, and we're all figuring this out as we go along. That's what's so exciting about it.
One of the nice things about collecting data over video conferencing is we were able to engage people who wouldn't necessarily have been engaged with research otherwise. So, when we think about the way that people of color have been treated in research historically, I mean, some of the very reasons why we have institutional review boards are things like Tuskegee, right? And those scars, run deep, right? That pain runs deep. And I think there was something about the collecting data on video conferencing calls that gave people a little more comfort. They were joining us from the comfort and the safety of whatever space they wanted to join us from.
And we created a video to recruit participants where we explained the project. And I think being able to disseminate that and have people see us talking about what our plans were and why, definitely for me it was a much better way to go through the recruitment process than just posting flyers.
So we've recorded, and by we I really mean Dr. Tripp and their core of undergraduate research assistants, have recorded many dozens of people, and many dozens of people who are not white. And we have a core of undergraduates who are pulling out the target words and sentences that we will use in our speech perception experiments. And so we'll be in a position where we'll be able to take those audiovisual sentences and put them in an online experiment that people will be able to do again from the safety of their own home. So in that experiment, we'll be able to present sentences to people either in the full audiovisual condition or just in an audio-only condition, and report back what they heard. So we'll be able to test whether or not the audiovisual benefit, by which we mean the improvement in speech perception accuracy in audiovisual conditions versus audio-only conditions is equivalent across race ethnicity pairings between talkers and listeners, or whether there is this asymmetry that the previous literature would suggest to us, this idea that people would be poorer reporting back what they heard in the audiovisual condition when the person does not match their own race ethnicity as a listener. And so that's kind of the ultimate goal of the experiment. Now, one of the things about the experiment that's going to have to wait is that we'll be able to collect a lot of perception data from a big set of normal hearing listeners, and we'll be able to get, I think, a more diverse group of normal hearing listeners than we would be able to get if people were coming here to the University of Minnesota. But there isn't a really easy way to do research on individuals with hearing impairment, which is another population that's of interest in this study, online. In general, those people are older. Because they're older, they're less technologically savvy. And so we do hope that in-person research resumes at some point so that we can answer that part of the grant. But I think in the meantime, we're going to have a really big sample of perception data on this important question. And the fact that we recorded our talkers in video conferencing means we actually have a kind of timely, an unintentionally, unexpectedly timely investigation to see whether or not the video view that you get in video conferencing really makes a person easier to understand. We took a subset of the sentences that have been used to elicit speech for, decades and decades. People have been recording people saying these sentences and using them as stimuli in speech perception research really since the late 60s, early 70s. And these sentences were constructed with two goals in mind. The first was that they had to be grammatical but not high in probability. So if you heard the first part of the sentence, you couldn't really guess what the second part of the sentence would be. So the sentences were really to engage people's attention throughout.
And that means that those sentences are the ones that our participants are most likely to stumble over and have difficulty repeating back correctly on the first try.
Right. So things like, her purse was full of useless trash, right? These days, a chicken leg is a rare dish. It's easy to tell the depth of a well. So these sentences were developed for that reason, and also they were developed so that the sounds and words in the sentences occur at reasonably the same frequency that they occur in communication, at least communication in the late 60s, early 70s. And these sentences have been used in more sociolinguistic, more socially meaningful speech studies, but nobody's ever really interrogated whether the sentences themselves are appropriate for those kinds of investigations. So one thing that Dr. Tripp and I did early on in the project, shortly after they started, was we did a big online survey with help from our colleagues in Lattice, CLA Lattice, where we took a set of sentences, these standard sentences. We took a set of these standard sentences and a set of sentences that we had called from Reddit. So sentences that were actually written by people engaging in social communication through Reddit, chat boards, whatever they're called, subreddits. And we had a group of people on we made a Qualtrics survey. Lattice made a Qualtrics survey for us. And we used the platform Prolific Academic to have 120 people read these sentences and for each one of them answer the question, how surprised would you be to find out that this sentence was that this sentence was produced by a man or by a woman? How surprised would you be to find out that the person who said this sentence was black or white or South Asian or East Asian? And what we found was that for these standard sentences, a good 20% of them actually do elicit a strong social cue. So they either elicit something about the gender of the person who produced them or the race of the person who produced them, or more often the age of the person that produced them. So in a lot of the cases, the language is so archaic that you think, well, this has to be somebody who's 70 who's producing this, because no young person these days would produce a sentence this way. And we're about to present that at a conference, a national conference, online of course, And that will be, I think that will make a nice little research note style article, because people are using these sentences as if the sentences didn't matter. All that mattered was the cadence, the tone of voice, and in our case, the visual presentation. But if the sentences themselves are giving you clues about things like age or gender or race, then it calls into question whether or not these sentences are really useful for their intended purposes now that it's 2020 and, we now have diversity. We always had diversity, but now that we're not just pretending that diversity doesn't exist, as was the case, when the sentences were devised, are they really appropriate anymore? And if people are going to continue to use them, really should people be making these kinds of measurements of just simply the written form of the sentence and using those as covariates in their data? I think one of the things that is radically different about this study is that within speech-language hearing sciences, nobody's really considering these social factors in speech perception. The vast majority of the work on this topic that has been done, and it's a pretty small prior body of literature, has been done within linguistics, has been done by psycholinguists and sociolinguists. So within speech-language hearing sciences, this is brand new. But even if you contrast this with the kind of work that's being done in linguistics, no one in linguistics who's interested in how social information shapes speech perception is considering questions about how this might disproportionately affect the speech perception of individuals with hearing impairment, because hearing impairment just isn't on the radar screens of people who work in linguistics, generally speaking. There are some exceptions. So that's the first thing, is that the first way I would characterize this as unique is that this is unique because it is uniquely cross-disciplinary. The second thing I would say, though, and this is one that I really would be happy for Dr. Tripp to hold me accountable for what I'm about to say, is, I think mostly because of Dr. Tripp's presence in this project, and secondary to that, because of our engagement and our place in Minnesota in the current reckoning of systemic racism and white supremacy, is I think we in this entire project have never lost focus on the fact that this is a project about dismantling racism in speech perception, both dismantling racism in speech perception research by saying we can't just study white varieties and say we're going to make generalizations about language, but also dismantling in the sense that we're looking at the very effect itself. Is the audiovisual benefit different depending on the race of the talker, the race of the listener, and their match? Not failing to keep in mind that an answer to that question of yes very well may be that systemic racism is so pervasive that it shapes the sounds and words that you hear on a daily basis. So I think and this is the place where I probably am, being the guilty as many white men are of, sort of overestimating my contributions in this area. But I feel like this is a place where I never want to look back at my career and feel like I just took topics that were of great social importance and used them for my own credentialist ambition. Right? So I don't want to just say like, oh, it's 2020 and I'm working on race. Woo, feature me in this video series. Woo, right? Like I actually want something to come of this that actually changes in meaningful ways the practices in my field and in the professions that my field trains for and in society writ large. And, I'm humbled and indebted to the people I work with for whom these issues are part of their lived reality on a daily basis, and eternally grateful that they share their knowledge, their expertise, their savvy, their cunning, their intellect, their wisdom with me in the context of our collaborative work on this topic.
Oh, thank you. My dissertation advisor is always telling me that I don't say enough to really emphasize how important and unique the work that I'm doing is. This is one of my weak points. This is selling myself. So oftentimes when researchers look at the effect of ethnic and racial differences, they confine their investigation to 2 or maybe 3 different categories. We set out to recruit from at least 5 different categories, but we're not excluding any participants for their ethnicity. So if they don't fit into those 5 categories, we have still included them in the study. And that's another thing that I think is unique about our approach.
Yeah, I think a lot of research I think the vast majority of research on race and language has focused on the difference between African American language and other white varieties of language. And here we sit in Minnesota where, many of the non-white communities in our Twin Cities area and in the state are neither of those. So we have this, big population of Southeast Asian individuals in the Twin Cities. And
East African.
East African, yes, absolutely. South Asian.
Southeast Asian.
Yes. Speech language hearing sciences does a lot of things. It does basic science research. We have a liberal arts BA. We have a research PhD. And we also have 2 graduate professional training programs, one in audiology and one in speech language pathology. And those 2 disciplines are among the widest disciplines in the country. Speech language pathology in particular, almost 93% of speech language pathologists are white and female. And this is a real crisis in our field. And as part of kind of the reckoning that's happening right now, our professional organization has faced a real outcry from a much broader portion of its members than have cried out in the past about the white supremacy that is evident in the fact that that is true and has been true for most of the duration of the profession. And so, our undergraduate student demographics don't reflect that quite as starkly, but they come pretty close to it. So we're talking more about in the mid 80s. So, maybe 85% of our students are white and female in SLHS. And so I think it's particularly important to talk about those issues of racism and sort of how racism has played out in speech language hearing sciences, even in these ostensibly scientific areas. So people might say, well, phonetics, that's the science of speech production. And if we're talking about science, this isn't really a place to talk about racism. Racism is something that happens in social interactions, not in capital S science. Yeah. And the problem then is exactly what Dr. Tripp just said. Whose speech production? And in fact, if we went into the hearing science course, which is another one of our undergraduate 3,000 level courses, everything we know about how the ear and the auditory cortex process speech is based on those particular varieties. So we have this whole field that's built up saying, oh, we're not prescriptivists. We're not telling you how you should speak. We're descriptivists. But what we're describing are white varieties. And by not describing other racialized varieties, we're making a pretty strong, unambiguous, implicit statement about their value. And I think, for students in phonetics, I was surprised at how receptive the overwhelmingly white class was to this notion. And in fact, I still regularly correspond with phonetic students who, are hungry to think about, what can I read about this? Or, what are some actions I could do in other courses that would challenge this? So certainly that has affected the way I teach. It's also, I think, a dangerous place to be to have someone with this much structural privilege as I am standing up and sort of preaching about this. I think it's really, I hope that this kind of research, the kind of research that Dr. Tripp and I are doing, is attractive to a diverse group of students, because we need fewer people like me making these statements and more people who can talk about them from a broader, from their lived existence as well as from a scholarly basis and sort of scholarship that they've done.
There is systemic discrimination against numerous marginalized groups, and language is very closely associated with identity and how people present themselves as belonging to different groups. So I think that our work is really critical in understanding how this process of understanding each other can be shaped and possibly disrupted by our beliefs about these social factors.
Historically, in both of our disciplines, both of our PhD training disciplines, linguistics and speech-language hearing sciences, a strong emphasis has been made on the scientific nature of our inquiry. And very early on in both of our disciplines, it was stated more or less, explicitly or implicitly, it was stated that we can't really consider social factors primarily because they would just make the whole endeavor too complex. And so what we're going to focus on are the more concrete objects that we can investigate using traditional scientific methods. So we have whole theories of communication and its disorders across our two fields that have been planfully asocial, and as a result, the fields have sort of backed themselves into a corner where all of these socially meaningful phenomena, all of the communication phenomena that exist in social contexts have kind of escaped a lot of our theories. They're not part of the purview of investigation in either of our fields. So you have speech-language pathologists, for example, who get this exquisite training on the structure of language, the structure of sentences, the composition of words, the articulation of sounds, and they go out to work in communities that are linguistically diverse and where the different language varieties are spoken by people with greatly different systemic power, and these people are not in the position to really understand how language and social identity and power intersect. So I think part of what we're doing for both of our fields is we're trying to really systematically bring in these questions in a way that calls attention to their centrality in both of our fields. I would say that, of the two problems that humans face right now, the two biggest problems that humans face right now are climate change and inequity, right? And so if we think about what Dr. Tripp just said, that the language that we use, the way we use language is intimately linked to our identities, both in ourselves and sort of the agency that we exercise when we use varieties to show different aspects of our identity and the way people perceive us. And if those are, primary ends to inequities, so if somebody's going to look at you and appraise you as different because of your language use, then we need to really understand the nuts and bolts of why and when that occurs and how we can stop it. And I think one of the things that really is unique about the way that we're approaching questions of race and language is we're not putting it on the people who use stigmatized varieties to change their language behavior to make communication go more smoothly. So we're not saying, hey, you use African American language, and that's probably going to trigger some racism, so don't use African American language. Instead, we're saying, hey, when you hear somebody who uses African American language, you're understanding fewer of their words, and as far as we can tell, it's not because the words are harder to understand, it's because of something else you're doing. We're putting it on the people who are perpetuating racism to change their behavior rather than putting it on the people who are the historical victims of racism to change their behavior to make it go away.
What I really love about being in this speech-language hearing sciences department is the philosophy that speech-language hearing sciences brings to communication as a human right, and that for all of the flaws in the discipline, this field exists to address disparities in access to communication. And I feel really excited to be on a project that's designed to create a resource which can be used long after we're done with the specific perception experiments that we proposed. I'm also excited about how this work has the potential to inform our work on looking at these same constructs from a developmental perspective. So as we learn more about how adults are processing these kinds of social differences when they listen to speech, that will help inform our future investigations into how these behaviors develop in children.
Once we finish this project on how race interacts with speech perception in older adults, we're in a really good position to go back and look at these questions in development. And within development, one of the really important questions to ask is, how children's performance on standardized measures that are administered with language, so standardized measures of language, are affected by the variety used by the person who's administering the test. There's this long-standing finding that kids who are economically disadvantaged have a word gap. So when you measure their vocabulary size using standardized tests, they perform more poorly than kids who are not being raised in poverty. And there are lots of questions to be asked here about how the variety of language that's being used in the test administration really drives this gap, and to be able to flip the question on its head and say, okay, if we take white kids and we give them these measures and we use Black English, we use African American English, African American language, do they show the same kind of performance decrements that we see in these kids who are ostensibly sort of language deprived? At least that's the way that they're characterized. Was that a fair sort of?
I don't know, it's just, I get so frustrated. I get really passionate about the word gap. This is something that Biden actually referenced in the debates. I don't know if you remember that coming up, that Biden said that, parents need to put on the record player at night and read to their kids, because there's a really long-standing idea in the literature that there's empirical evidence to support this perspective that children who are exposed to, who aren't spoken directly to as often, don't have the same language skills. And it's usually assumed that that means their language skills are deficient. However, I believe that children who are acquiring non-mainstream dialects are having to do more social processing in order to know the significance of the different dialects they need to navigate and what it means to switch between them when other people do it. And that this sociolinguistic knowledge is not measured in standard assessments of language ability. If it's true that the social circumstances, the variety, the identity of the test administrator in these standard assessments of language impacts the performance of children, that would show we're getting a really one-sided picture of what it means to have good language skills. And that children who aren't required to actually learn code switching, they are never described as deficient, as lacking linguistic skill. And I think in order to really accurately assess how language development is proceeding in these different populations, then we really have to bring these questions about social factors into our methods and into our investigations of how psycholinguistically words are understood in real time.